They said racism was over, that if you worked hard enough, kept your head down, and stayed focused, you'd make it, that the world was fair now, equal, post-racial. But that day, standing on the stage under the blinding lights of a packed college auditorium, I realized something terrifying. It's easy to dismiss a wound you've never had to heal. It started with a challenge, a viral clip, a conservative speaker, bold and confident, standing at the center of a campus debate, saying the words that would change everything for me. Systemic racism doesn't exist. Prove it. The crowd roared. Some laughed, others clapped, and me? I just froze, because for the first time, I didn't have the words. I'd lived it. I'd seen it. But could I prove it? Could I turn something so heavy, so painful, into facts and evidence that couldn't be debated away? That night, as I scrolled through comments online, thousands of them, I saw the same challenge repeated like an echo. If racism is real, show us. So I decided to try. I wasn't going to argue with emotion. I was going to argue with truth. But truth has a way of leading you places you never expect. My search for proof didn't start in a textbook or an article. It started in my grandfather's attic, buried beneath boxes of old photographs and yellowed documents. There, I found the first clue, a faded letter from the 1940s, stamped with official government ink, denying him the benefits he'd earned serving his country. That letter didn't just change his life. It shaped mine, decades before I was even born. As I pieced together what really happened to him, and what that meant for the generations that followed, the word systemic stopped being theory. It became personal. It became bloodline. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that proving racism wasn't about winning a debate. It was about confronting the inheritance of inequality that had quietly written my family's story. And as the day of the debate approached, I started to wonder, was I walking into a conversation or a battlefield? Because some truths don't just demand to be proven. They demand to be felt. And once you feel them, you can never go back to pretending they don't exist. This is a story of a debate that changed everything. Not because I won or lost, but because I finally understood what I've been carrying all along. So before you decide whether systemic racism is real, let me show you what I found. Before that debate, I lived a life that looked normal. If you passed me on campus, you'd probably think I had it all together. Headphones in, backpack slung low, a quiet confidence that came from being used to standing out. I was that kid, the one who always raised his hand in lectures, who could turn any essay into a performance. Political science major, debate team captain, a scholarship student who worked nights at the campus library to cover what the scholarship didn't. I loved ideas, arguments, theories, history. I loved believing that if you just had the right words, you could change someone's mind. I believed in logic, in evidence, in reason. But logic doesn't prepare you for the kind of truth that hides inside your own life. Most days, I didn't think about race. Not really. Sure, there were the usual micro moments. The security guard following me at the bookstore, the professor who praised me for being so articulate, the classmate who joked about affirmative action scholarships like they were handouts. I'd learned to brush it off, to keep my head high and my tone calm. Like my mom taught me, never give them a reason to call you angry. At home, things were quiet. My mom worked long hours at a community clinic. My little sister was in high school, and our evenings were a blur of reheated dinners and quiet exhaustion. Our walls held old family photos. My grandfather in uniform, standing tall in his army portrait. My grandmother smiling proudly beside a small house that was never fully paid off. I didn't think much about those pictures. They were just background, family history, until the night I saw that clip. It was a Thursday, late. I was scrolling through social media, trying to unwind after grading debate club submissions. Then I saw it, a trending video of a conservative guest speaker tearing through a crowd of students with a kind of confidence that only comes from certainty. The moment that stopped me wasn't his statistics or his tone. It was his challenge. Systemic racism doesn't exist. Prove it. The audience laughed. The clip ended, and something in me twisted. I'd heard arguments like this before, clean, sharp, dismissive. They always left people stunned, not because they were right, but because they were loud, and I was tired of loud winning over truth. So I made a decision that night, the kind of decision that feels brave when you make it and terrifying the moment after. I emailed the debate committee and volunteered to face him at the next event. A part of me wanted to prove something, not just to him, but to myself. I wanted to prove that our pain wasn't invisible, that history had fingerprints all over our present. But even as I hit send, I felt a tremor of doubt. What was my proof? What could I possibly say that a crowd conditioned to disbelief would hear? I told myself I'd find data, research, economic charts. I'd craft the perfect argument. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be won by numbers. The next few days blurred into preparation. I studied every major report on racial inequality, housing, education, employment, wealth gaps. My desk was buried under printouts and highlighters. But the more I read, the more detached it all felt. Cold facts about warm lives. Percentages that couldn't explain the look in my mother's eyes when bills piled up. Then one night, my mom passed by and saw what I was working on. She smiled, proud but tired. "Your grandfather would have loved this," she said. "He always believed knowledge was the only real weapon." That made me pause. I hadn't thought about him in years. My grandfather had been a soldier, fought in World War II, came back home expecting opportunity, dignity, a fair shot at the American dream. But he never got it. The GI Bill, the very thing that built the post-war middle class, was supposed to give veterans like him a home, an education, a future. Yet, somehow, he ended up with none of those things. When I asked why, my mom shrugged. They said there were no openings left, no loans available in his area. Her tone was casual, almost resigned, as if it had always just been that way. But that night, those words wouldn't leave me. No loans available. I knew enough history to recognize what that meant. And that's when the idea hit me. Maybe the evidence wasn't in a spreadsheet. Maybe it was in my bloodline. So I started digging. Old letters, files, photographs. I called relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Each memory they shared peeled back another layer of silence. It wasn't just about my grandfather. It was about everything that followed. The home they never bought, the education my mother couldn't afford, the savings that never existed. The ripple effect of one denial, passed down like a hidden debt. The next time I stood in front of the mirror to practice my opening statement, I didn't sound like a debater anymore. I sounded like someone trying to make peace with a truth that had always been there, waiting to be seen. The debate was only days away, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was ready to win or ready to understand. The first time I opened my grandfather's box, I expected dusty memories, not evidence. Inside were black and white photos of him in uniform, medals tucked neatly beside folded letters. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but one line caught my eye, stamped in bold type from the Veterans Affairs Office. "Your application for home and education benefits has been denied due to ineligibility under current guidelines." I read it again and again. Ineligible. The word stung. He'd fought for a country that told him afterward he didn't qualify for the freedom he helped defend. I looked up the dates. The GI Bill had been passed in 1944, promising education, housing loans, and business grants to millions of returning soldiers. It built generations of wealth, entire suburbs, the American middle class itself. But not for everyone. As I dug deeper, I discovered the pattern. The bill didn't mention race, but local offices, run by white administrators, decided who got what. Banks refused black applicants. Universities quietly turned them away. My grandfather had served, but when he came home, the system served him denial, written neatly in bureaucratic ink. It wasn't a story from history books anymore. It was my family's inheritance. And the more I learned, the more the room around me seemed to shrink. My mother's long shifts, the apartment we could never quite leave, the student loans that shadowed my life, it all traced back to that letter, that one moment of exclusion. I felt angry, but beneath the anger was something heavier, realization. Systemic racism wasn't a theory to be debated. It was a chain reaction, one policy, one denial, one door closed at a time. And the echoes of those doors still slammed in the present. I started seeing the pattern everywhere. My friend Malik's dad, a decorated veteran himself, had also been denied a mortgage back in the 1980s. A teacher from my neighborhood lost his job when the school district restructured, but somehow only the older black staff were replaced. Each story was a thread, and when I pulled, they led to the same fabric, stitched with quiet, intentional inequity. Every discovery felt like fuel. The debate was only days away, and my research had turned into obsession. I spent nights in the library archives, piecing together data and stories like a detective chasing ghosts. Charts showing racial wealth gaps over 70 years. Maps of red-line neighborhoods, entire regions boxed by red ink labeled hazardous for investment. Guess where my grandfather's address fell? Dead center. I traced those maps to modern census data, and the pattern hadn't vanished. Lower home ownership, lower funding, lower opportunity, different time, same result. That realization hit harder than anything I'd studied before. It wasn't about individuals being racist. It was about a system built on exclusion, designed to look neutral but never truly reset. But even as I gathered all this proof, doubt started whispering again. Would they even listen? Would they hear me? Or just see another angry black student making excuses? That thought haunted me. I remembered my debate coach's advice. Facts don't change minds. Stories do. So I stopped rehearsing statistics and started rehearsing truth. The night before the debate, I went to my grandfather's grave. I hadn't been there in years. The grass was overgrown, the stone faded. I knelt beside it and whispered, "I think I finally understand." In that silence, I felt something shift. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about giving voice to the people who were never invited to the debate in the first place. Still, part of me was terrified. Because telling the truth in a room built on denial, that's not a conversation. That's confrontation. When debate day arrived, the campus felt different. Crowds gathered early, cameras out, waiting for another viral moment. Some came to learn. Others came to laugh. The air was electric with tension and expectation. As I walked toward the auditorium, I passed flyers calling it the Great Debate on Racism. My opponent, the same conservative speaker whose clip had started it all, smiled as I entered, confident, relaxed. He shook my hand like he already knew how the story would end. I took my seat at the podium, notes trembling slightly in my hand. The moderator's voice echoed. Tonight's topic, systemic racism, myth or reality. A hush fell over the crowd. He went first. He was smooth, polished, talked about progress, equality under the law, personal responsibility. He quoted numbers about graduation rates, job growth, even a few black CEOs. Each point drew cheer from one side of the room. I sat there listening, my pulse hammering. Every argument sounded airtight until you knew what it left out. When it was finally my turn, the stage lights felt blinding, my throat dry, my mind racing. I glanced at my notes, the data, the maps, the reports, and then I saw the folded letter in my pocket, the one from my grandfather's box. That's when I knew how I'd begin. But before I could speak, I looked across the room, at the crowd divided by disbelief and defense, and realized this wasn't just about him or me. It was about us. I took a breath, the kind that feels like a plunge before the fall. Because once I opened my mouth, there'd be no going back. The truth was about to walk into the light, and I had no idea what it would cost me. The lights burned hotter than I remembered. Rows of faces blurred into a single, expectant stare, some skeptical, some sympathetic, all waiting to see whether I'd stumble or stand. I could feel the weight of my opponent's smirk from across the stage. He'd made his case, polished, confident, airtight on the surface. The crowd loved him for it. He'd painted America as a land of endless opportunity, where hard work beats skin color. He spoke of victim mentality, of personal responsibility, and every line felt like a knife wrapped in applause. Now it was my turn. I gripped the podium, feeling my heart pound through my fingertips. My voice trembled on the first word, but I forced it out anyway. I want to tell you a story. Silence. Even the restless ones leaned forward. It's not a story from a textbook or an article. It's from my family. I pulled the folded letter from my pocket, the one that had changed everything. This letter was sent to my grandfather in 1946, after he returned from serving in World War II. He was promised help, education, housing, a fair chance. But this letter says he was ineligible. No reason, no appeal, just denial. I read the line aloud. The words cracked as they left my mouth. Then I looked up. My grandfather fought for a country that refused to fight for him, and that decision, written in black ink on a piece of government stationery, shaped everything that came after. My mother grew up watching her parents work twice as hard for half as much. They never owned a home. They never built savings. I carry student loans today because he never got the house or education he earned. A few murmurs rippled through the audience. This isn't history. This is inheritance. I could feel the shift, the kind that happens when people realize the story isn't about someone else. It's about them. I told them about the maps, the red lines drawn across neighborhoods, the banks that refused mortgages, the school that decayed because of zip codes. I showed how those lines didn't vanish. They evolved. Today, those same areas have lower property values, fewer jobs, underfunded schools. The descendants of those who were excluded still start behind, not because they didn't try, but because the race began before they were even born. And then I paused. I looked at my opponent, calm, unshaken, waiting to pounce. He leaned toward his MIC with all due respect. He said, "None of that proves racism today. Things have changed. We have equal laws now. The past isn't holding anyone back." The crowd clapped again, and for a second, I felt the old fear rising, that my truth would be swallowed by performance, that the system we defended was built to make stories like mine sound like excuses. But something inside me refused to shrink. "You're right," I said softly. "The laws changed, but the impact didn't disappear. It multiplied." I could feel my pulse racing, but my voice stayed steady. When my grandfather was denied a home loan, he didn't just lose a house. He lost wealth. He lost a legacy. Every generation since started from less. And that gap, the wealth gap, the education gap, the opportunity gap, isn't imaginary. It's measurable. You can trace it line by line, family by family. It's not a mindset. It's math. The auditorium went still. Even the cameras stopped moving. I looked around, at the students, the faculty, the people filming for clicks. "This isn't about guilt," I said. "It's about gravity, the weight of history that some of us are still carrying while others get to walk freely. Systemic racism isn't a feeling, it's a force. And whether you see it or not, it's shaping the ground we all stand on." My throat tightened. I hadn't planned to say this part, but it came out anyway. I used to think I was lucky, that if I just worked hard enough, I could outrun it. But you can't outrun something you were born inside of. The system doesn't chase you. It surrounds you. A hush settled. Even he didn't interrupt. And then, something unexpected. From the back of the room, an older man stood up. His voice was unsteady but clear. "My father got that same letter," he said. "Same words. Same stamp." Every head turned. The silence cracked open. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was a chorus, buried memories surfacing all at once. Murmurs turned to confessions. Students whispered about grandparents, about housing denials, about the things they'd always assumed were bad luck. For the first time, I saw the truth, not as argument, but awakening. I looked back at my opponent. His expression had softened, not in defeat, but in discomfort. The kind of discomfort truth brings when it refuses to be ignored. I closed my notes. I was asked to prove systemic racism exists. I said, "So here's my proof. I am it. My story is the data you won't find in a spreadsheet. My life is the evidence. Every door closed as someone like my grandfather created a wall I still have to climb. That's not coincidence. That's design." The crowd didn't erupt. They didn't cheer or clap. They just listened. And in that silence, heavy, electric, human, I felt something shift. For the first time, I wasn't debating him. I was holding a mirror to all of us. The moderator called time. My opponent's lips parted like he had something to say, but no words came out. I stepped back from the podium, heart still pounding. And as I walked off the stage, one question echoed in my head, the same one that started it all, but now it sounded different. If systemic racism doesn't exist, then how do you explain me? The applause came late. Soft at first, hesitant, like people weren't sure if it was allowed. Then it spread, rippling through the auditorium until the whole room was standing. But in that moment, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt quiet, because what I'd shared wasn't a win, it was a wound. And for the first time, people were finally looking at it instead of looking away. After the debate, students came up to me in clusters. Some just said thank you and left. Others stayed longer, wanting to tell me about their own families, their own invisible histories. One girl, pale and trembling, said her grandfather had bought his first home through the same GI Bill my grandfather was denied. I never thought about how different that must have been, she whispered. Her voice broke halfway through, and I realized that's what change sounds like. It's not cheers, it's silence breaking. The next morning, the clip went viral, not because of an argument won, but because of a truth revealed. Student destroys speaker with personal story, the headline said, but I didn't destroy anyone. I just connected dots that had been there all along. Within days, messages poured in, from veterans, teachers, parents, even economists. Some thanked me for speaking. Others accused me of playing the victim. But for every insult that arrived, 10 people sent stories. Proof layered on proof, pain layered on pain. It struck me how many of us have been carrying these stories quietly, thinking they didn't count as evidence. As if living through injustice wasn't enough to name it. And that's when it hit me. The biggest success of that night wasn't changing my opponent's mind. It was breaking the silence around the system. Because silence is where injustice hides best. A week later, I went home to visit my mom. She'd watched the video on her phone. When I walked through the door, she didn't say anything. She just hugged me, long and tight. Then she went to her room and came back holding something small. It was a photo of my grandfather, the same one from his army days. She turned it over. On the back, in her handwriting, she'd written, "You prove what he couldn't say." That single sentence hit harder than any applause. I realized I hadn't just been preparing for debate. I'd been finishing a story my grandfather started but never got to tell. He fought a war abroad and came home to another one. Quiet, systemic, buried under paperwork and polite denial. And decades later, I had finally brought that buried truth to light. That was the real victory. Over the next few months, the university's Diversity Council invited me to speak. I turned my research into a small project, mapping how policy from the past still shape housing and wealth around our city. Every map told the same story. History doesn't fade. It compounds. And every conversation revealed the same pattern. People didn't disbelieve because they were evil. They disbelieved because they'd never had to look closely. I learned something else. 2. Proof doesn't always live in statistics. Sometimes, proof is a life someone has to live just to be believed. That debate didn't make me an activist. It made me aware of the systems beneath the surface, the patterns we inherit, and the power a story to pierce through disbelief. I started to see how many people, students, families, workers, were still being measured by the limitations others left behind. A landlord who preferred a certain kind of tenant. A hiring manager who called a name too hard to pronounce. A neighborhood where the schools still lacked funding, decades after redlining ended on paper. Different rules. Same result. It's easy to call it progress when you only measure distance, not direction. Sometimes I think about that speaker, the one who said systemic racism doesn't exist. We never spoke again, but I heard he canceled his next event. Maybe he just moved on. Maybe he didn't want another confrontation. But maybe he went home and started to look closer, too. Because once truth enters a room, it doesn't leave quietly. Today, I keep my grandfather's letter framed on my desk, not as a reminder of pain, but as a compass, a reminder how far silence can carry a lie if no one interrupts it. People still debate racism like it's a theory to be proven. But you can't quantify loss passed down through generations. The lost homes, the lost chances, the lost peace. You can only feel it in the fatigue of a mother working double shifts, in the debt that follows students who started behind, in the neighborhoods where opportunity skips a generation. That's a legacy of denial, and recognizing it, that's where change begins. The debate didn't end with applause. It ended with awareness, and awareness is a dangerous thing, Because once you see the system, you can't unsee it. And neither can the people watching. I don't know if I prove systemic racism exists that night. Maybe proof isn't the point. Maybe the point is that some truths shouldn't have to be proven to be believed. If you're watching this right now, maybe you've never seen it up close. Maybe you've never had to. But look deeper. Listen longer. Because silence is comfort's disguise, and comfort is the enemy of progress. This isn't about guilt. It's about responsibility. Because every generation inherits not just history, but the duty to rewrite it. And the next time someone says, prove it exists, ask them, what if the proof has been living all around you, all along?